Hello and welcome back to this Oral History podcast series, a journey through the past, present, and future of mining. I'm your host, Mónica Ospina, joined by my co-host, Priscilla Nelson. In today's episode, we take a deep dive into the history of the mining industry and its evolving role in both environmental and social impact. We also discuss the importance of regulatory frameworks as mining practices evolve amid growing environmental concerns in the mid-20th century, and the important impact of Brundtland Commission. We'll be exploring how key moments like the rise of the environmental movement and the independence of developing nations in the 60s and 70s have shaped the industry today. Joining us again are Glenn Sigurdson and Luke Danielson, who bring their extensive knowledge and experience to help us unpack the complexities of mining impacts on communities and the environment.
That's right, Monica. Today's conversation covers everything from the evolution of the term development to the growing regulatory frameworks that have emerged in response to mining's global footprint. We'll also touch on the challenges of legacy mines, the role of artisanal mining, and the crucial issue of water, which remains at the heart of many conflicts between mining companies and local communities. It's a rich discussion, so stay with us.
There were a number of major trends that exploded in the 1960s and 70s. To understand these phenomena, I think we need to realize there were several different trends, each of them extremely important and interesting in its own right. One of them was the explosion of the environmental movement and environmental consciousness. One of them was the independence of developing countries and their desire to chart their own future in the interest of their people. And one of them was that the technology of the mining industry resulted in bigger mines with more impact and more visibility. So all of these things came together, and mining in many ways was a lead economic sector, maybe the lead economic sector in creating some of the changes that have occurred. Obviously, a major landmark along the road was the Brundtland Commission, the World Commission on Environment and Development. We all see it as very fuzzy and positive at this point, but at the time, there were tremendous conflicts within the participants over the relative priority of development and the relative priority of protecting the environment. I don't know, Glenn, if you see it that way.
Yeah, no, I see it the same way, Luke. I guess the word development has migrated over time. It's a much more holistic kind of concept at the moment that embraces social development. Back when I was studying economics in the 1960s, development was economic development, and that was the focus of any discussion. So when they talked about development economics, it was about the development of economic drivers. And there was no regard really for how they would intersect with social, political, and environmental factors. So in studying in graduate school in economics, the work I was doing, as I related to last time at the Center for Settlement Studies, looking at the whole portfolio of considerations for single enterprise towns ranging across the whole gambit from psychological to economic drivers. At that time, that was starting a breakthrough that simply hadn't existed in any way in development economics, from my recollection of the studies in those days. So I agree with you, Luke. These evolution that took place with the World Commission on the Environment was really a breakthrough where we now started to talk about a combination of forces that were social, environmental, and economic that had to inform decisions going forward. It was fundamentally rethinking the public-private interface between what is private and your responsibility to do things and what role kind of public interest and public interest considerations had to come into decision-making. And that was a huge step forward.
I didn't realize you and I both started out as economists, I guess. At least I did, and I studied development economics, and I agree with your comments. This field was focused very much on the cash economy and on numerical indicators of economic development, but that didn't necessarily meet the needs of a lot of people, still doesn't.
And just picking up on that, I mean, that is at the essence of why I started to shift from economics and walked away one day from a major graduate program at McGill University. I wasn't just satisfied that a mathematical formulation of the world and econometrics and other advanced statistical methodologies that were being used simply explained the social and political dynamic in which economic activity had to take place. And that was a major factor in causing me to go back to the work I'd been doing at the Center for Settlement Studies. And I was working at a major university at the time, McGill, and I just realized one day walking up the hill, this is just not going to work for me. This is just not going in the right direction where I want to be. And secondly, it looked to me like it was a career path that would lead to being a professor, and I was a bit too pragmatic to do that. But all of these factors, when I think about it now, when we call input-output analysis, when we talk about all of the kinds of things that were going on there was so many externalities that weren't included in any way in the cost calculations.
Yeah, and it became clear that mining was creating some disaster areas. Canada had one very prominent one at Sudbury, but the mining industry became more and more and more mechanized, and the machinery got bigger and bigger, and right. We wound up with places like Oktedi in Papua New Guinea, with like Konkola in Zambia, like Cerro de Pasco, like El Salvador mine in Chile. We wound up with these areas where mining was devastating the local environment and was failing to produce any kind of linkage that could create any kind of ongoing development when the mining ended.
In the 50s and the 60s, as mining was starting to build increasing traction and visibility, it had, of course, been a major part of Canada's landscape for a long time, dating back to a mine like the Cominco property that had a 100-year history. The fact is that the biggest concern that was prevalent in Canada as roads were opening up in the 50s, the Roads to North program was a major activity of the Conservative government in the 50s, was the concern that somehow there would be such a revolution in First Nation communities, Indigenous communities, as we knew, because of these road connections and the different degree of interactions that would start place, were largely looked at as potentially very negative forces that would impact these communities in disastrous ways. So roads became kind of a concern point, and that was a lot of the issues that mining camps would start abusing and exploiting local communities in different ways. They would create the capacity for all kinds of negative social implications in these communities. So that was a huge growing issue. But that's really how the first manifestation, as I recall it, started to occur at the interface between mining and Indigenous communities in Canada, roads.
I see a lot of this through the lens of one particular mining project in the state of New Mexico, a copper mining project where my father was born. His father was the mine doctor, but El Chino started mining in the 1790s under Spanish management. It transitioned through the Mexican Revolution and Mexican ownership, through the Mexican War into U.S. ownership. But the one thread that went through it all was the absolute devastation of the local Apache community. Mm-hmm. The Chiricahua Apache wound up being spread all over the world. They were taken to Cuba as slaves. They were in Michigan. Their entire community there was just devastated by a succession of of outside interests managing this mine.
And these are the kinds of things that were bubbling, growing, but it was not anything that happened at a moment in time. It was growing. And I remember one of the concepts that we were working with in economic development was what people call the revolution of rising expectations. The concept was that when the transistor radio was invented and was being accessed into remote communities, they would develop all kinds of expectations that were not fulfillable, and that was why they called it this revolution. So even then, technology was starting to play a role at that very early point, and that's always stuck with me, that we were worried that people would start knowing too much and expecting too much. And that's back in the invention of the tiny transistor radios when they first came on the scene. So these kinds of forces were creeping in all kinds of ways and bubbling towards where we ended up with the World Commission. These were all the kinds of things in play. But at the same time, Luke, we had these enormously big mining towns that were being built back into the early 1900s, where the full responsibility for the whole community, I guess, I'm sure in Colorado you've got a deep experience with this, but in Canada we had the Forest Company in Powell River, we had the huge Caminco property at Trail, we had Thompson, Manitoba in the 50s. The entire infrastructure of a huge town was being built by these companies. So they were really operating as a world unto themselves under development agreements, admittedly, but they were not really the subject of any regulatory overview as I understand that history. You probably have a better understanding of it than I do.
Well, I don't know about that, but when, let's just say, the U.S. West was being settled, it was being settled by miners. And the face of development to indigenous communities was miners showing up and wanting to take over their resources. So over time, we have developed, it may still be inadequate, but we've developed this superstructure of regulatory authority at the local, national, international level. And that's really a large part of what our story's about, is how these regulatory systems were developed. But you're right, they, as recently as the 60s, they barely existed.
And in many of the places that you worked internationally, because your career has been much more international as mine, and you've worked with many governments around the world. And one of the themes that you've touched on with me is how these countries are still in regulatory vacuums in many places in the world, and it's really the big mine development agreements that have been shaping the legal regime in many of these places, etc.
It is true that it's very hard for countries to develop the kind of environmental regulatory system that you see in Europe or North America. It requires a lot of capacity. It requires a lot of financial resources, professional skills. And in a lot of places, what you see is mining occurring in the absence of national system of regulation that works. In the absence of national regulation, what the tendency has been to try to make international rules. So we've got this kind of strange system where Europe and North America still have a lot of their own national rules, and they have a lot of say over how things are done, whereas the developing world is largely subject to these international systems, which in many cases they didn't have much say in developing. Right. So
that's even been the case in the last 20 years as your work has continued. So you can imagine, in the spirit of our backcasting, what was going on 50 years ago. And if they didn't have that kind of regulatory regime in the last 20 years, they certainly had no regulatory oversight of any kind 50 years ago.
Right. And, I think the Brundtland Commission and the World Commission on Environment and Development pointed out this problem, but didn't really start to solve it. The real traction, I think, started with the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. The Rio Declaration and the Convention on Biodiversity were, in fact, legal instruments. I only wish we were back in the day when 85 or 90% of all the countries in the world would sign on to some legally binding system. But the Rio Declaration and the other agreements of Rio started to create a framework of rules. And I think that then moved into the 1996, the World Bank came up with these performance standards, which truthfully were the first international regulation that really had any bite to it. At that point, we started developing these international systems that actually had some traction, maybe not enough. Maybe there are all kinds of criticisms of the system. The basic idea was you can't get a loan if you don't follow these rules. Right. So we wound up with a consortium of banks through the Equator Principles of the world leaders in this area. And obviously that brings huge issues of fairness, participation, and, if the banks are running everything, where's democracy really?
I guess some of the first kind of real pressure points that were starting to find expression through the growing international environmental movements that were taking shape was the pressure on the World Bank in the late 80s. That's really when they started to come under attack. I think the Three Gorges Dam may have been one of the first real big pressure points. They were funding these massive infrastructure projects, and the question was, to what extent did they bear a responsibility in moving that kind of money into these countries to take into account some of the social and economic and environmental consequences? I remember in those days reading extensively because I was considering applying for a job at the World Bank. And one of the things that was on my mind was to take some of the understandings that I developed through the massive agreement I'd been part of negotiating in northern Manitoba, where we built a very ongoing framework of a resolution of disputes as they would arise as that system was developed. And there was a lot of similarity to the kind of challenges that the World Bank was facing that we'd faced in designing an approach in the late 1970s, early 80s in Manitoba. I gave that serious thought, but it never materialized. But it caused me to focus my mind on what were the kind of steps that would need to be taken to manage the kinds of issues that were arising in these kinds of disputes.
One of the interesting things, the performance standards of the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, they created 8 chapters essentially of pretty complicated and detailed rules for anyone who wanted to get a loan. And then under the Equator Principles, the great majority of at least the Western private banks signed on to the same principles. The question, though, was, okay, what's the enforcement mechanism? Mm-hmm. The enforcement mechanism in the World Bank system is something called the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman. And their case studies of the complaints that have been brought to them are just fascinating reading. One of the things that interests me is if you look by economic sector, I think mining is by far the most overrepresented sector in the complaints that they received over the years. Mining and minerals are a major part of the business the compliance advisor does.
And when did that come into place? Can you recall that, Luke? What year that was? Because you were involved in one of those major complaints and actively you and Jay Hare, as I recall, were you not?
Yeah, our work led to the 1996 promulgation of these standards. Our project was not a mine, but a dam, the Pangue Dam in Chile. But since the standards have gone into effect, it's amazing how frequently the compliance advisors been called to step in cases of mining. What wound up happening was we wound up with a series of these international processes designed to create benchmarks for the industry. An early one was the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, which dealt with mining companies and essentially their security forces, which had been stepping in and becoming kind of a police in a lot of areas. And in there are some cases where company guard forces wound up committing some pretty significant human rights abuses. So the other issue, of course, was corruption. So we wound up with a world process that led to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, but we wound up with one after another of these processes designed to add to the world list of rules.
But we're now crawling into the 2000s. That's just fine. But this is kind of an evolutionary process that spun out as there was a proliferation of these kinds of initiatives starting as early as the early 1990s, and then they were growing over the next decade. And by the time we were involved in MMSD and you were taking such a major leadership role there, many of these things were already on the way or envisioned, and much would take off after that commission. But let's just go back for a bit further, back to some of the earlier developments that took place even around the time of the World Commission on the Environment. There was ILO 169, right. And you were working in Latin America in the 90s and the early 90s. Tell us a little bit about your recollection of that whole period and what had caused that to move in the way it did at that period. That was a significant development, was it not?
It's taken it a while to really start to have any kind of a real binding effect. So a lot of these countries, and of course the majority of the countries that signed that convention are Latin American countries, a lot of them signed up to this and said, this all sounds great. We'll consult the indigenous communities, et cetera. But if you look at what they did, it was very much business as usual. So on one hand, lip service to the need to consult indigenous nations and a reality of business as usual. That has changed now, but only in recent years is it becoming, are there effective remedies? Let's put it that way. The remedies were not there in the early years. There's a lot of concern and complaining, but not a whole lot of impact at the time. But and then, of course, later is the 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
But if we look back at that period, it is evidence of the fact that there was a growing awareness, particularly in Latin America, around indigenous issues in that context, and it was given expression through ILO 169, which was really a treaty. And right. What I think you're saying is that it was not sort of finding its way into the legal jurisprudence until very recently. I think there's been some recent cases that have actually given it teeth, but that's 25 years later that I was reading that this development is starting to take place.
Yeah, that's right. I would just say this, as a group of us as co-authors have just published a book about how ILO Convention 169 has now found a home in the jurisprudence of the right. Supreme Courts of most Latin American countries, and they're making some pretty shocking decisions, like your mining concession is invalid.
Invalid, exactly.
Yeah, but the Supreme Courts of the Latin American countries, in at least some cases, are starting to show a willingness to step on even the toes of the rich upper classes that have tended to dominate the mining industries.
But it's a lesson in itself, if we just kind of caption that, to think that the awareness happened and was given expression in the 1980s, and it's not being given real teeth in terms of any impact until 2015 or 18 or in that period. And so much of what you and I have experienced in our careers, I think, is an expression of that. This world moves very slowly and it goes backwards and forwards in unpredictable kind of ways, but it takes a long time for change to happen. And that's a very good example, it seems to me, to highlight that what was recognized and what became a reality in practical terms took a lot of time.
It's an astonishing transformation over centuries, and it's painful, but the first European approach to mining in the New World or the Western Hemisphere was probably people like Christopher Columbus, who landed and within weeks was enslaving indigenous people and forcing them to mine gold for it. Where I live now, to do a land acknowledgement, was territory of the Ute people here in Colorado. We, at one point, asked the Ute to move west of the Continental Divide and told them that if they did, we'd protect their land rights west of the Continental Divide. But miners started coming in and they started finding mineral deposits. And the next thing you know, we displaced the Utes pretty much out of all of Western Colorado, but nobody was really thinking about their rights. They're thinking about how to get their hands on the minerals.
At the same time, Luke, let's just explore another aspect of that. And that's that as there became an awareness of how those powers that were moving in to take these minerals, there's also a growing indigenous mining industry, an artisanal mining industry, isn't there? I mean, that's been around for a very long time, and you must have been exposed to that to a much greater degree than I've been, given your experience in Latin America, because there isn't a lot of artisanal mining in Canada, or hasn't been historically, but I think there has been in Latin America.
Well, there has been. There, of course, was here in the West, the gold panners, the California 49ers, where a lot of them would have to be called artisanal miners. But even today, it's kind of this strange industry where I'm picking a number out of the air and saying 90% of the people who are employed in mining today are employed in artisanal mining. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, 90% of the mineral production comes out of the industrial mining sector. It varies a little bit by commodity. Emeralds are still overwhelmingly produced by artisanal. Diamonds in some places are still overwhelmingly artisanal. But then there's other commodities. Nickel, for example, I don't think there's any artisanal production of nickel. It's all produced by a relatively small number of very large industrial mining companies. But the artisanal sector, the national mining sector, and the international big mining companies are coexisting. They all are still a part of this industry.
And I guess that's one of the very great dangers, it seems to me, when we have the kind of discussion that we're having, is that there is an inevitable tendency to focus the conversation around big major mining companies, but that's not the reality of the industry. The industry is comprised of everything from small scale mining, perhaps artisanal with a pick and shovel or a pan, or small mining operations, junior operations exploring. We have such a panorama of players that it's easy to lose sight of the complexity, because all of that is part of the dynamic and context and the food chain that feeds these majors. But to understand it only through the lens of a major is really to miss a major part of what the challenges are in confronting many of the issues that we've been confronting for a long time.
The other dimension that is really important is mining is only part of a important cycle of processing and fabrication into products. And, a boatload of copper concentrate, which is what leaves most of the developing countries today, And the other part of this story is the extent to which the industrial countries have monopolized the processing part of the chain, right? That was the colonial system. We produced the ore in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America, but the ore is turned into useful products in Europe
Right.
or in Japan or in North America, and the industry's been set up in a way that most of the profit and most of the financial rewards are in the processing end, and the miners are by and large producing raw commodities.
It's very interesting to reflect back on all of these kinds of forces, and one of the implications that processing has had in the artisanal community, where extracting gold requires mercury. This has had huge environmental, human health consequences, and remains one of the major issues that is an unresolved issue going forward. And it's happening right today with Bunsen burners and mercury being spilled around to extract gold with these small-scale miners.
Yeah, it is. And it also is, however, at some of the big mining operations, the prevalence of lead contamination and the impact on people of getting lead into their food chains or into their bodies. Cerro de Pasco, the majority of the people who live near that mine have highly elevated blood lead levels. So, the impacts are very real, but both the benefits and the impacts are unevenly distributed, right? The people who are benefiting are in one place, the people who are being adversely impacted are in another place. What's fascinating to me about it is this is one of the few industries where a board of directors of highly educated northern people are meeting in London, and they're impacting the village council of elders in some rural part of Papua New Guinea. And those two groups of people are impacting each other. But you don't see people developing high-tech industries and computer chip manufacturers in rural New Guinea. It's the mining industry which creates that direct interface between the wealthy and powerful and the rural poor of the world.
When I mentioned earlier about my dad receiving a call that there was mercury shutting down Lake Winnipeg back in 1967, and he thought it was the same stuff that was in thermometers rolling around, he may have sounded naive, but in the mind of toxicologists, they were baffled. They had no real awareness even then as to what they were dealing with. And it would be 10 years later that we also came to understand that mercury is endemic in the Canadian Shield, in the granite rocks. And as you have impoundments of hydro flooding, this was leaching into the water systems. And it brings me to the whole big area that you and I dealt with in many of the conversations we had during the MMSD process. And that was this whole area of legacy mines and what is represented in the ground in many of these regions that have to be recognized as part of baseline studies as you move into these areas. I think legacy mines was about the biggest issue we confronted within many of those workshops, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it still is. I'm fascinated by this idea that there are mines unable to close. In Chile, El Salvador was started by an American company more than a century ago, but was acquired when Chile nationalized the copper industry and is part of a state corporation now. But they're out in the middle of a desert. There's no other economic activity around. There are people who are fourth, fifth, or even sixth generation miners who live in that community. If they stopped mining there, all those people have to leave and go somewhere else because there's no livelihood there. And so what you've seen is that the Chilean government, I think, announced that El Salvador was going to close in 2008. And then when 2008 got there, they said, oh no, it'll be 2010. And they've continued to kick the can down the road now for 15 years. And the closure of El Salvador is nowhere in sight. We see the same thing at Concola in Zambia. The Zambian government could not deal with the social and economic impacts of closing that mine, so they're trying to find ways. And sadly, in many of these places like Octeti, or there are other examples, the way that government keeps these old mine projects going is by lowering the environmental standards to lower the cost. And it's getting worse and worse at a lot of these sites.
There's also the fact that there's a large capital investment in building a mine. So there's a great driver to keep trying to find deposits of increasingly small amounts to maintain the continuity of the production, as opposed to building another facility that's going to be at very large cost. The profitability is one based on marginal costs, and oftentimes you see that in the pulp and paper industry, for example. In the pulp and paper industry on the Slave River, they were deliberately not licensing new properties or new mill operation because the river was already overloaded with outdated technology. So you have the counterintuitive kind of conclusion in many of these cases that the capital investment precludes in large measure technological innovations, because there's still profit to be gleaned by maintaining these older operations.
Although in most of these cases, what you see is the big international mining companies, who are very wise about these things at this stage, realize they don't want to be caught holding the bag. Right. So BHP got itself out of Octeti, and Anglo American got itself out of Concola. You look and the companies that did hold the bag, there's no better example than ASARCO, American Smelting and Refining Company, which was the most successful and the most highly admired U.S. mining and smelting company not that long ago. But they wound up owning, I don't even know how many Superfund sites.
Right.
They had, the lead Superfund site in Omaha, and the Tacoma Smelter Superfund site, and the cadmium site at the Globe Smelter in Denver, and El Paso, and you just keep going on. And they wound up, the other big private mining companies saw this coming and said, we want out of here, and found one way or another to divest themselves of these gigantic, highly contaminated legacy sites.
Right. Let's pick up one other theme I think that we haven't really touched on, but is going to be increasingly relevant as we move back to our base point of the World Commission on the Environment, and that's water. Water is just, it's all about water today, but water was gradually kind of creeping into the environmental consciousness, and the connection with mining was becoming increasingly clear over the 60s, 70s into the 80s. Sure. What's your perspective on that?
Well, look, half of all of the streams in my state of Colorado are impacted by drainage from old mines. Of all the environmental impacts mining might have, its impact on water is the one that is most damaging to people, most damaging to the environment, and most concerning.
I was in Peru, I guess, about, it must be 10 years ago now, and I spent about a month there in connection with some other work I was doing, but I had very extensive conversations with a wide range of people. And I remember speaking with the people in the Ombudsman's office there, which is connected to the legislature. There's also an Ombudsman's office of some kind connected to the President's office, but over 200 of the mining disputes that they were dealing with, of about 240, were all water-based. So Sure. That's where you have real direct connection to people and conflict. And I've been in the business of managing the conflict that flows out of change processes. And the interesting thing in understanding water is that you have to understand it from 2 points of view. There's one, the access to water. And, when we have a big mining operation or any mining operation that comes into an area and they say it's a game changer. Yeah, if I'm a local peasant and I see a huge mine coming in, it's a game changer, all right. I'm 55 years old and I'm not interested in working in that mine, but I know it's going to be a competition for water in an already arid zone.
It's happening right now in lithium production in the deserts of Argentina, Chile, and Peru. But the impact of mining on water on indigenous communities that are dependent on water is a crisis at this point, because we now have decided that we need lithium to deal with our response to climate change.
From the early development of massive mining towns to today's pressing water crisis, it's clear that while the industry has grown, so too have the challenges it faces in being more responsible and sustainable.
Absolutely, Monica. What really stood out to me was the complexity of the mining sector, not just in its size, but also in how it interfaces with communities, the environment, and even global regulatory frameworks, emphasizing the need for evolving regulations and international standards for a more sustainable global mining industry. It's a reminder that mining doesn't happen in isolation, and the decisions made in boardrooms have real impacts on people and ecosystems far away. Water especially continues to be a focal point of these issues.
Thanks again to Glenn and Luke for sharing their individual insights, and thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. We encourage you to reflect on how we can collectively shape the future of mining through responsible practices to create a solid foundation for global supply chains. We invite you to share your views and comments. We would love to hear from you and learn from your perspectives. We hope today's episode has helped shed light on the broader implications of mining and why sustainable practices are more important than ever. Until next time, stay curious and keep engaging with the big questions.
Right, and in the next podcast, we'll dig into the growing environmental consciousness of the 1960s and 70s and how it catalyzed change in the mining industry. What role did public outcry and environmental disasters play in shaping today's standards? And how did companies start navigating the balance between profit and environmental responsibility? Don't miss the conversation as we examine the roots of modern sustainability and the regulatory systems that emerged in response.